Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hi everyone, I'm Crystal Contreras and I'm the director of Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. Welcome to today's program with award-winning historian Keisha N. Blain. She will be in conversation with Amy Allison, founder and president of She the People. If you'd like to ask either of our speakers a question during this program, you can do so in the comment or chat section of the live stream that you're currently watching. This program is part of the Commonwealth Club's Ideas Inspire series, dedicated to informing, inspiring, and encouraging youth to be empowered citizens of tomorrow. We want to give a special thanks to all the students who are joining us today and to let you know that we want to hear your voice. Be sure to ask questions and post your comments in the chats, and note that you are a student when you do so. To learn more about the Commonwealth Club's education programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org/education. Now, please join me in welcoming Keisha N. Blain and Amy Allison to Inforum.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. My name's Amy Allison. I'm founder and president of She the People. Welcome to tonight's virtual program with Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. This evening, I am so thrilled to be in conversation with Keisha N. Blain. Keisha is an award-winning historian, associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. And today at Inforum, Dr. Blain will peel back the layers of Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist too often forgotten in the narrative of racial justice. Dr. Blain's new book, Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America, details Hamer's life and accomplishments, many of which have left lasting and influential effects on social justice and community organizing today. And before we start, a quick reminder, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please ask it in the chat or comment section. We'll try to get through as many as we can before our time together is through. Let's get started. Welcome to the conversation, Dr. Blain.
Thank you so much. I look forward to our conversation tonight.
I just want to tell you on a personal basis, because I have my copy of your book and have had the real pleasure of spending time remembering why Fannie Lou Hamer was personally important to me. But my first question is, what first drew you to telling the story of Fannie Lou Hamer? When did you first learn about her yourself?
Well, I first learned about Fannie Lou Hamer as a senior in college. And it's interesting because at the time I was majoring in history and Africana studies. I was taking all of these courses primarily on the ideas and experiences of Black people. And so it's somewhat shocking that it took me that long still, given that background. But it was a senior year of college. I was taking a course on the American Civil Rights Movement, and this is spring of 2008. And one of the things that really stood out to me immediately was what I talk about in the book as Fannie Lou Hamer's radical honesty. It really surprised me that she could speak so powerfully about racial injustice, and she could do so in the presence of anyone. I was particularly moved by the 1964 testimony that I think many people are familiar with, where she spoke at the Democratic National Convention in August 1964, spoke powerfully about state-sanctioned violence, about voter suppression. And I think encountering Hamer in that particular moment was transformative for me because I saw so many connections between the two of us, certainly as a Black woman, but also as someone from a working poor background, as someone who, as a first generation college student, I was, somewhat certainly excited to be, in college pursuing a bachelor's, and at the time imagined that I might one day obtain a PhD. I had these big dreams, but I also worried about the feasibility of all of this. I worried about, how could I in fact obtain these goals? How could I in fact make a difference in the world? How could I in fact leave a mark given the limitations as it pertained to the material resources that I didn't have. And Hamer's story was one that inspired me. It showed me the power, really, of purpose, of having a clear sense of purpose, and knowing that regardless of the challenges that you're facing, regardless of the limited resources that you might have, the key is to make sure that you're using your gifts and abilities to make a difference, no matter how small. And I think I found in Hamer's story certainly inspiration to make my own life decisions. And of course, I would go on to obtain a PhD, and in fact, write the books that I imagined I would write on on Black history, on the Black experience in the US as well as globally. And so Hamer is someone who I credit as really moving me and inspiring me to make a difference.
It's amazing. And, she was, a lot of people may not realize she didn't enter into the movement for racial justice and the movement of, social justice until well in her 40s, having spent decades as a sharecropper.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about your book that really made an impression on me was how you keep going back to her quotes when you say she spoke the truth, and so much of her organizing seemed to be, predicated or based on speaking that truth about her own lived experience.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it was, I think, important for me to center her words as much as possible, and I sometimes chuckle about it because as someone who teaches a range of courses, when I talk about writing with my students, I often say to them, try to avoid quoting so much, try to avoid using block quotes. And there's so much emphasis on, the researcher's voice, the writer's own voice. But in this particular book, I wanted to strike a balance between my own critical analysis and my own assessment of the primary sources, of the documents, of the speeches, and so on, but also make sure that I was not losing sight of Hamer's actual voice. There was a moment where I said to myself, you can't paraphrase certain things. That when Hamer expressed her views, she did so in a way that was so raw. She didn't hold back. As I point out in the book, she did not subscribe to any kind of respectability politics. This is a woman who had a sixth grade education. As you pointed out, someone who had lived as a sharecropper, did not become an activist until the age of 44. She did not know the lingo, so to speak. She didn't have the experience in these spaces. So she did not show up well-groomed, so to speak. She just told you the truth that was on her mind, very blunt, so honest, but it hit to the core. And once she spoke to you, even if it made you feel uncomfortable, it was transformative. There was no way that her words didn't affect you, right? You had to sit with them because they were so powerful. And I wanted readers to get a sense of that in the book. And so I constantly tried, as much as I had to assert my own voice as the writer, it was important for me to tell the story centering Hamer's words as much as possible so people could, in fact, hear for themselves. And I wanted it to feel as though they were in the room with Hamer. And she's no longer with us, but her words are still here, and her words are so powerful.
They are very, very powerful. And having a collection of Fannie Lou Hamer quotes, I hadn't seen that before to the extent. I want to talk about her life. You recount from her very, very young age of 6, being approached by, I guess, a former plantation owner and her experience with racism. But talk about her earlier life and some of the experiences that led her to later dedicating herself to social justice.
Hmm. I think it's so important to talk about the sharecropping system when we begin to imagine how Hamer came to be Hamer. One of the most difficult aspects of writing this book was having to sit with a lot of the painful experiences that Hamer endured, and to know that they started so early in life. At the age of 6, as you point out, Hamer was actually lured into sharecropping, and this was the white landowner. And just to provide a bit of context for those who might not be familiar, sharecropping is the system of labor that developed in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so once slavery was abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment, white landowners, in fact, introduced this system of sharecropping as a way to keep Black people in a constant cycle of debt and certainly dependency. And it meant that many individuals who, of course, with emancipation should have been able to have full access and opportunity, even for land ownership, but that was not the reality. And so Hamer's family, like so many other Black families in the U.S. South, were trapped into this system, oftentimes working on the very same plantations that they had been working on under the institution of slavery, or their relatives had been under the institution of slavery. And Hamer simply one day, just on the plantation with her family, the white landowner approached her and said to her, why don't you pick some cotton? He lured her into picking cotton with the promise that she would be able to get candy and other things from the store. She was only 6 years old, and this sounded like a pretty good proposition to pick cotton and be able to get some candy, but it was a trap, and it was meant to ensure that she would prematurely begin contributing as a sharecropper, contributing to the white landowner's wealth. And that's what she did. And she did that until she joined the Civil Rights Movement in 1962. And so she experienced a lot of hunger and poverty. She talks about, her early life of oftentimes not knowing where the next meal would come from, certainly watching her parents struggle to make ends meet. She also talks about, the trauma of racial violence, of her knowledge of a lynching that had taken place in the Mississippi Delta that transformed her and helped her see just a myriad of challenges that Black people were facing living under these conditions. And so all of these things factored into, I think, her decision later to become a voting rights activist, because for Hamer, by the time she finds out about her constitutional right to vote as a citizen of the United States, she realizes this is the key. This is the key to overturn systems of oppression broadly, but these are, the ability to vote is the key to change not only Mississippi, but certainly to bring about tangible changes on a national level. And it's so inspiring for her, and it's empowering, and she wants to take that message to every single person who's willing to listen. And so she jumps right in. Yeah,
I was going to say this was early 60s with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi. And you write about this beautifully, but you write about when she got on a bus to register to vote in 62 and seeing all the police lined up and going in a building and being forced to take a literacy test, and what that was like for her, the threat of violence, the threat of police violence, and then going back where she worked as a sharecropper. Tell us more about what that was, because that was in the 60s, and we have the stories that are popularized about the civil rights movement. Most of them center on experiences of the men who were front, leading movements. But this is not a commonly told story from a woman's perspective.
Mhm. Yes, and in fact, I think when we look at Hamer's story, we begin to see so many of the layers, but even what we talk about now in the modern context as intersectionality, to borrow from Kimberly Crenshaw. And uh, as you point out, in August 1962, Hamer joins the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. The first thing that she does is she volunteers to help. She volunteers to attempt to register to vote, and she's of course committed to ensuring that others can register to vote. But she travels with a group of activists. As you point out, they encounter a number of roadblocks, and this is a moment that I think Hamer talks about as being somewhat surprising, because for Hamer, what is powerful about that mass meeting that she attends in August 1962 is the emphasis on the US Constitution. It's the emphasis on particularly the Reconstruction Amendments. And so activists who were there that night are saying, listen, you have the right to vote as citizens of the United States. You've been granted that right since the 19th century, in fact. And so she knows that, at least on paper, according to the Constitution, Black people are supposed to be able to vote. And let's remember, again, we're talking about 1962. So this is not only so many years after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. We're talking about also many years after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Of course, we've been particularly talking about it over the last several months in, I would say, broad celebrations, but mindful of the limitations of its passage in 1920. And Fannie Lou Hamer realizes a number of things. She realizes that despite what's on paper, there are a number of strategies that white supremacists are employing to block Black people from the vote, to ensure that they don't have the ability to exercise those rights. And that includes, as you point out, the literacy test. Hamer, with a sixth grade education, is given this literacy test with detailed questions about the Mississippi, about the state constitution. She's not familiar with these things, and quite frankly, as we know from the history, many of the people administering the test didn't know much about this, themselves. But it was a strategy. It was a way to ensure that Black people would not have the access to the ballot. And the literacy test, combined with just intimidation, violence. She talks about the encounters with the police, just a number of legal and extra legal strategies were being employed to ensure that those rights that were granted since the 19th century would not actually be of any use for Black people. So much so that, as I point out in the book, an estimated 5% of the Black population in Mississippi at the time was registered to vote. 5%. We're talking about 5% of estimated 450,000 people. We know the implications of that, what it means to have so many people's voices not represented. And so her experience, I think, peels back the layers of the violence, certainly the challenges of racism. And to the point of what Hamer experiences when she comes back from this trip, she's unsuccessful the first time. When she comes back from this trip, the first thing she endures is having the white landowner tell her, listen, you need to go and withdraw your registration. You need to not be involved in this movement, or you can leave the plantation. And she makes the difficult decision to leave. She leaves her husband.
And her husband and her were working there at the time. He had to stay, so she had to leave her husband.
Exactly.
And she and basically have no job. Right. And is that the moment that she declared, like, basically dedicated herself full time to the movement?
It was. There's an interesting interview in the process of doing the research that I came across where Hamer is talking about this moment, and she says that it was certainly a difficult moment for her because she thought about all those repercussions. She thought about the financial aspect. She knew this would be a huge blow on the family, but she said that it was the moment that she was set free. And she said, because indeed what it did is it opened up for her the opportunity to thrust herself fully into the movement. And that's what she did. I mean, she lost her job, and she was using a lot of her time to ensure that she would advocate for voting rights. And she said it too. She said it was clear to her how powerful it was, because if someone could go to such great lengths to ensure that you don't have the right to vote, then you know that this is going to be the tool that will make all the difference. And so it was clear that she needed to hold dear to this and keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing.
You know, many of the chapters in your book link very famous modern day cases of state sanctioned violence against Black women, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor. In the case of the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement, for the murder of Mike Brown. And you talk about its deep and historic connections, and Fannie Lou Hamer's story is deeply linked to her own experience with state-sanctioned violence. And I think I want to ask you both what she personally suffered as a Black woman from what abuse and violence she experienced, what she witnessed, and her response. How did her response to that set her, apart from other kind of strategies in organizing?
This is such an important part of Hamer's story. I referenced earlier this notion of radical honesty. But one of the strategies that Hamer employed, which I think we can often take for granted, and that is the strategy of public testimony. We don't often think of it as a strategy, but I think it is in the larger struggle for human rights. And so let me kind of explicate what I mean. Hamer, even before she joined the Civil Rights Movement in 1962, experienced something quite terrible, which I think is worth emphasizing. And that is in 1961, a year before she joined the movement, she was the victim of forced sterilization. She had been hospitalized to remove a small uterine tumor. It was non-cancerous. And the white doctor who performed the procedure, unbeknownst to Hamer, decided to remove her uterus. This was a very painful, traumatic experience. And it's one that Hamer endured, but to be clear, it's one that many Black women, women of color, particularly impoverished women of color, in the South primarily, but not exclusively. This was something that took place nationally. And Hamer, I think, was certainly shocked, angry, as one can imagine.
But she'd been trying to have a baby. I just want to,
yes,
it's the detail that you added. Yeah. She had been trying to have children, and she'd had a miscarriage before.
Right.
She went in for health care. The doctor removes the uterus, but she did not know. So sterilizes her. And she didn't find out until later through gossip.
Yes. To add insult to injury, she finds out through gossip because the doctor was related to the wife of the plantation owner. And that wife decided to share the information. Hamer learned about it through the Whisper Network. People were talking about it. She did confront the doctor, as I explained in the book, who didn't provide an explanation. He didn't have to, as she pointed out, because this was not only common practice, but there was very little that Hamer could do. What could a Black woman living in the Mississippi Delta with limited material resources, in the context of the Jim Crow South, what could she do? Hamer figured out that there was something she could do, and the answer came through public testimony. It was, how do you sort of flip the script? You are clearly victimized in that particular context, traumatized even. And all of this takes place in secret. Certainly people are talking about it on the plantation, but it's not widely known what has happened to you. I think there's so many people in that particular situation who would not want to talk about it. And we would understand. I think everyone would understand why someone would not want to talk about it widely. Hamer decided that as part of her effort in the struggle for civil rights, it was important to shed light on the kinds of things that Black women were experiencing. And so she started talking about forced sterilizations. One of the first documented civil rights activists to openly address it, to talk about it all over the country, to address it in the presence of folks in the medical field who at times didn't even have knowledge about the practice. She would shed the light. And for her, that was a way to, one could say, almost take back her power, because now she could, one, not have to take on some sort of shame that wasn't hers. She did not commit the act, right? It was not her shame, as painful as it was. Now it was an opportunity for her to have others see clearly what was happening to Black women, and then compel them to do something about it, right? Because when you don't know, then the excuse is, well, I didn't know, so how could I fix a problem of which I'm not aware? Well, now you know, it's on you. And that's what I talk about in that chapter, about this idea that people become co-owners of trauma through the act of public testimony. And here I'm borrowing from the work of Kidida Williams, another remarkable historian. And Hamer took that to heart. So it was speaking out against forced sterilization. It was speaking out against state-sanctioned violence. She experienced a brutal beating in Winona in '63, which again was a moment where she could have easily retreated. She could have easily said, this is too much. There's no sense in pushing forward, fighting for rights when I'm constantly going through these painful experiences. I mean, that Winona beating left Hamer with a number of ailments. As I point out in the book, Hamer was a disabled activist. She walked with a limp, and the beating in Winona worsened that limp, as well as left her with kidney damage. It left her with blood clot in her eyes. I mean, this was very difficult physically, as it was difficult emotionally. And Hamer still decided that she would talk about it. She spoke about even the sexual abuse, right? Because there were all of these sort of elements to it that she wanted people to be aware of.
There's difficult. A character, very difficult. There's a character of her courageous leadership and testimony that finds so much power in that vulnerability. And we can see in some of our greatest leaders, Black women today, who through speaking out the trauma and the decision. I mean, I'm thinking of Congresswoman Cori Bush on the steps talking about her personal homelessness. I'm thinking of Congresswoman Barbara Lee talking about being a 15-year-old forced to go to Mexico for an abortion. I'm thinking of really women all over the country, across race, who have found such strength in testimony, publicly testifying. But it does have, I think you've written about it. It isn't an easy thing to do. It's a very powerful thing to do. It's very different than the men who led in the civil rights movement. I'd say very different. I want to talk to you about her remarkable leadership and challenges with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. She's a person, as you said, that believed in the Constitution. She believed in the amendments, the Reconstruction era amendments. It guaranteed Black people and all people the right to vote. And she believed that the political process had to change. And so she organized and gave that famous speech, which was aired nationally. Can you set us up? What happened at that moment, at that DNC that year, where Fannie Lou Hamer gained national prominence?
Yes, and this is, I think, an aspect of Hamer's story that most people know a little bit about, which is that they are aware of that speech which she gave, but they don't often know a lot of the context around it. And what is so interesting about that moment is it certainly catapults Hamer's political career. It's the moment that people on a national level find out who she is. but it's also the moment that she endures, I think, a lot of resistance within the movement. And so to give context, as you point out, Hamer played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which had been established only months before the Democratic National Convention in August. And this party was established to challenge the state party, which was an all-white party. The Mississippi Democratic Party, as many other state, Democratic parties, so this was by and large Southern Democrats at the time, were not open to the idea of having Black people involved. Certainly not in the political process broadly, and certainly not in the party. And Hamer worked to challenge this. And when she showed up in August 1962, the idea was, or rather August 1964, the idea was that she would certainly shed the light on the exclusionary practices of the state party, and she would demand that the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party, recognize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party instead of the all-white state party that had excluded, as I pointed out, an estimated 450,000 Black residents in the state. She certainly, I think, expected resistance from white people who were going to be at the DNC. But I think she did not anticipate the resistance she would face from other Black leaders, from other civil rights leaders. And I talk about the tensions that emerged with individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, very important voices in the struggle for Black freedom. But these are individuals who were thinking differently. And their attitude was, we need to certainly point out the challenges, we need to advocate for Black political rights, but we also need to think about the long game. It is this sort of approach to politics where you don't push too hard in a particular moment because you're thinking about what you might be able to accomplish in 5 years or 10 years. An incremental approach. Hamer was not about that. So she demanded representation. She wanted those seats on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Well, they had offered her 2 non-voting seats, and she said no.
Exactly, and these are these are symbols essentially, which gets us to, I think, a broader conversation even in today's context about what it means to ask for certain rights and privileges and then be given symbols, right? I mean, we saw this even recently. I would argue people demand changes when it comes to policing, and what's the response? Well, voila, you can now celebrate Juneteenth. I mean, it's not to diminish Juneteenth, but that's not what people were demanding in the streets. And so in a similar kind of way, Hamer says, I'm not interested in these 2 non-voting seats. I mean, these are symbolic gestures. They don't mean anything. And I did not leave Mississippi to come all the way to Atlantic City to leave with gestures. I came here because I'm representing people who have real needs and concerns, who are going through, who are going through hell. I mean, people we're talking about a moment. I mean, just to give context again, this is Mississippi. I think most people will know the Emmett Till case, for example, of 1955, right? I mean, Hamer's aware of all of these things. I mean, this is not some sort of distant memory to her. She's aware. Not to mention she's seeing violence on a day-to-day basis. So this
is urgent for her. This is urgent.
Absolutely. And so she is upset with leaders who are talking about what she views as a kind of gradualism. It's let's take this now because, and to be clear, these individuals are thinking strategically insofar as they're saying, listen, it's August, right? There's an election, there's a presidential election coming up. So let's be careful what we do in this moment because we want to make sure that we can work in the future with Lyndon B. Johnson. We want to think about all the kinds of things that we could potentially accomplish. And in truth, of course, this is all happening before the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65. I mean, I would argue that it's Hamer's powerful testimony. It's her resistance in the moment that moves a lot of this forward, not to diminish the work of any other activists, but the irony is that they were pushing her to acquiesce for the sake of progress, but ultimately her voice, I think, left a mark. She terrified Lyndon B. Johnson. She gave a speech that he tried to prevent by holding impromptu press conference. In the end, those who heard the speech were deeply moved, and once again, her public testimony made a difference. And not surprisingly, not only the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but even by the next Democratic National Convention, it looked very different, than the one of '64. So Hamer encountered, I think, a lot of resistance internally, and I'll just point out two brief examples to my point. Roy Wilkins, who I talk about in the book, who's a leader in the NAACP, he described Hamer as an ignorant woman, and that was, I think, a moment that reflects the multiple things. Certainly, one could talk about the class dimensions, but I think there's also a sort of patriarchal.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
I was like,
yeah,
I was, that woman.
Yeah.
And there weren't that many women in the civil rights movement that were spokespeople that were. I mean, she was unique in that way. And these
Right.
are the names of people. I mean, we say Wilkins' name, it's like he's revered, but when you expose the sexism, then it gives a different view. You wrote something in you have this scene in the book where in the wake of the speech to the committee, where she's arguing that the Mississippi Democratic Freedom, the multiracial Mississippi Party, should be fully seated with votes. And in the wake of that, you had some of the very famous leaders that you've talked about trying to wheel and deal in a hotel room, and not invite her.
Yeah.
How did she handle that? Because a lot of us have been in those situations where, hey, she's pushing too far. Let's just do an in run around her.
Right. She did not have it. I mean, she would not accept it. As soon as she learned that a meeting was taking place without her, I can almost envision her running to the room. I mean, she crashed the party, and she forced them to actually move outside of the room because, of course, the attitude was, there's no space. Well, fine, then let's get out of the room. And let's have this conversation where not only I can be present, but others can be present too. She was deeply committed to the idea of grassroots leadership. And that meant making sure that everyone's voice could be heard. She resisted this idea that only certain people were the leaders, only certain people could speak on behalf of communities, or only certain people could make those decisions. And let's be honest, there were many people who I think present at the convention and elsewhere who would have only identified, for example, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as the leader. He certainly was a leader, but he was not the only leader. And Fannie Lou Hamer wanted to make sure that above all else, that her voice was heard on behalf of her people, right? She always would remind folks that she was representing not just herself, but she was representing the people of Mississippi. This reminds me of an interesting encounter, which I think is indicative of all the tensions we're talking about. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who I think most people certainly know, prominent Black politician, was in a similar vein, as other leaders, trying to get Hamer to acquiesce, trying to get her to see a different perspective, trying to get her to accept the compromise. And he said to her, he was not getting the response that he imagined. And so he said to her, do you know who I am? And she, and of course, we know the layers of that, do you know who I am? It's like, I'm Adam Clayton Powell. Like, I'm telling you something, you have to listen, because I come with authority, I come with experience. And she said, yes, I know exactly who you are. And then she posed a question to him, which I think is so powerful. She said, how many bales of cotton have you picked? How many beatings have you taken? And that was classic Hamer. It was this idea that, listen, I'm absolutely going to respect your title, your position, your experience, your expertise. All of that is wonderful. But you know what my experience is? It's violence in the state of Mississippi. It's poverty, it's hunger. I too have experience, and my experience is grounded, right? It's a lived experience of being a sharecropper for all these years. And so when I'm speaking, you have to listen to me as much as you expect me to listen to you, right? And it was a way to signal that she would not simply allow people to brush her aside because of her lack of experience in their view, and because of her limited formal education. All of these things she resisted.
It's so powerful, and it's so clearly the Black woman's voice. You wrote, and I'm doing my best to quote or paraphrase, despite and because of their mistreatment in American society, Hamer argued that Black women occupied a unique place in society, echoing a long line of Black women activists who came before, including Black radicals Claudia Jones and Louise Thompson Patterson. She maintained the belief that Black women were at the center of interlocking oppressions of race, gender, and class, and that we as Black women, she said, have a job to do to support whatever's right and to bring injustice where we've had so much injustice. And I think that the story, the book talks so much about that unique role and job of Black women, even till today. You're writing this about Fannie Lou Hamer, who lived many, many decades ago. Would you say that that's still the job of Black women today?
I think so. I have a mixed feeling, a mixed reaction, because I certainly agree with Hamer, but there is a part of me that hates to have to agree, because I am frustrated by the fact that Black women to this very day have to constantly work so hard, quite frankly, to save this nation. I mean, it almost feels like at every moment there is a crisis, and we saw this just in the last couple of months. I think, for example, someone like Stacey Abrams come to mind. It is wonderful, just and quite remarkable. But I also say, why does it always have to be, the burden? Of course, or some would not use the word burden, but you think about it this way, that Black women still are among the most disrespected in American society. And I'm, sort of quoting here from Malcolm X, who made the observation. And yet they're constantly relied upon, expected almost, to come up with the strategies to help build this inclusive democracy. And I'm not suggesting that others don't play a role, but it is frustrating that there is this grand expectation, and yet when Black women are looking for the support, it's not always there. When they're looking for the help, it's not always there. And we see that in Hamer's life too, right? I mean, she sort of sacrificed so much. She gave of herself. And then when you get to that last chapter, so many people reach out to me and they said, when I get to the last chapter, I just can't stop crying. Well, it is painful to see how someone who gives so much of herself, who's so selfless in this struggle, not only for herself and for Black people, and to be clear, I mean, she is as much a human rights activist as she is a civil rights activist, which I point out in the book. To do all of that and yet find yourself in just a dark place towards the end of her life, looking around for people to help and not necessarily finding them. And it makes me think about, it makes me feel conflicted about the sort of expectation, the burden. I agree. I do think, I very much think that it is powerful for Black women to lead, and in fact, I think it makes me think about the Combahee River Collective, which comes a bit later in '77. The Black feminist, Black lesbian feminist group, which emphasizes the centrality of Black women's experiences and makes a case that, when Black women are liberated, other groups by extension will be liberated. All of that is powerful, and I accept that. But I do still feel a sense of frustration that it has to be this way. It really should be a collective effort always. That's my sense.
Yeah, a lot of us can relate to that. And this conversation is not just amongst Black women. And in fact, the name of your book is Until I Am Free,
Right.
Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America. And I wonder what your analysis of both what her message is, what's her enduring message, not just to fellow Black women, but to all of America. What's the message that her life, her sacrifice, her patriotism is for us today?
The message is truly encapsulated in the title. As Hamer traveled across the US, she would say often, nobody's free until everybody's free, or sometimes she would put it another way, whether you are white or Black, you are not free until I am free. And that to me is so significant. I understand that not everyone will fully embrace that message. I certainly hope that more people will, because it's a message that gets us to move beyond the individual and truly to the collective. To this very day, we are constantly battling, I think, what one might describe as a struggle between the individual and the collective. When you make a decision, do you make a decision simply because it will benefit you, or do you make a decision thinking about the whole, thinking about those around you? And Hamer's message to every American, certainly, and I think this really transcends national borders, but the message was that we are all part. We're all part. So within the national context, right, we're all part of the American polity. And even widely, we're part of this human family. And what that means is that when one person is hurting, it has an effect on us. Even if you don't see it in your everyday life, right? You may not have to worry about an encounter with the police. You might not have to think twice about applying for a position and experiencing discrimination. Maybe that's not your experience. But to know that someone else has that experience should bother you enough. To know that someone else has to be, concerned every time they have an encounter with law enforcement in a way that you might not have to be concerned, like that should bother you, because in fact, you cannot experience true liberation if anyone around you is in chains. I mean, that's the message to America. And I think if all of us had that political vision, certainly most of us had that vision, things would change rapidly, because we would spend a whole lot less time saying, well, I didn't experience this, or, well, I didn't have a problem getting a mortgage, so what are you talking about? Well, okay, but we're trying to tell you that other people are having challenges getting mortgages, right? Other people are having challenges when they walk in with the very same credentials. And other people are not getting the same response from their doctors as you might. And that fact should bother you enough, because this is a collective, right? This is our nation. We are all responsible. And our fates are connected. Whatever this nation becomes will ultimately affect all of us. So this is a message that I think is so enduring. And I hope that those who read the book will be moved to begin thinking that way, if they're not already thinking that way. And Hamer certainly wanted that message to be heard loud and clear.
And I wonder, as we move on to questions, if she'd be surprised that her message has endured. Well, let's have some audience questions, a couple of live questions for students to start. Rachel Koenige is studying political science at UC Berkeley and has a question.
Hi, my name is Raquel Kanugi. I am a senior at UC Berkeley studying political science. And my question is, what is the first steps that we as consumers and perpetuators of history can take to seek out and learn about these powerful figures, especially women like Fannie Lou Hamer, that history has tried to push to the wayside?
I would say several things. I mean, one of the reasons that I try as much as possible to write in all kinds of venues. I think sometimes I know some people are often surprised, to see me writing for MSNBC, for example, and they'll say, "Are you a journalist?" I'm like, "No, I'm not a journalist. I'm a professional historian. I teach at the college level. I write books on history, but it's so important for me to be writing in these spaces because I've learned, through experience that so many people do not have access to a lot of the information that I have access to a lot of the information that my students have access to. And I think of myself as an educator broadly, far beyond the four walls of any institution and any physical classroom. I think of the world as my classroom in that sense. And I think writing in these spaces provide a way to ensure that information gets out to a broader public, a broader community, beyond the people that I may encounter on a day-to-day basis. And the truth is, so many amazing writers, historians, but not exclusively historians, people from all different fields are writing accessible articles and books that ultimately I think make it a lot more difficult to say, I don't know or I didn't know. I mean, now we have Google, and I always, I smile when I think about it, how quickly one can find information. And so what I think is important is not simply relying on what might be taught even in the classroom setting. And I say this as someone who, I spend a lot of time putting together syllabi, but I love it when my students reach out to me and say, Professor, I'm not sure if you saw this, I came across this article, it adds this other dimension to our conversation. And that to me is powerful because I think it helps to show the role that all of us can play collectively in the process of educating. And so it's not just a one-way street, right, in that sense. And so I would say make full use of an array of resources that are available. I'm the president of the African American Intellectual History Society, so I have to put in a plug for our organization. That's what we do. We are committed to producing scholarship that's accessible to all. I would also mention, the Zinn Education Project. I mean, just so many easily accessible outlets where you can find both primary and secondary sources that shed light on Black women's experiences, in particular to your question, but broadly share light on all of these narratives that tend, to be overlooked in traditional kinds of settings. So I hope that's helpful. And I'm certainly doing my part, and I know so many others are trying as much as possible to make that work available to all.
Thanks, Dr. Blaine. And that was a great question, Raquel. One other question, freshman at San Francisco State University, majoring in broadcast and electronic communications, Demille Taylor, why don't you ask your question?
Hello, Dr. Blaine. My name is Demille from San Francisco State, and I wanted to know, along with Fannie Lou Hamer, who are some other unsung female activists from the civil rights era that you've learned about or would like people to know about?
There are so many women, and one comes to mind particularly because I was just reading about her in the news, and so hopefully people are seeing the news circulate about Claudette Colvin. We generally talk about Rosa Parks in the context of the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, and Rosa Parks is certainly important in the larger narrative, but we don't often talk about Claudette Colvin, who was only who was a teenager, I think about 15 years old, and months before Rosa Parks refused to get up, and Claudette Colvin did the same, and she refused to get up when a white bus driver asked her to move in order to give the seat to a white person. And many people don't know her story, but it's such a powerful one, not only in seeing Black women, we're talking about Black women, but to emphasize that this was a teenager, to help us see how vital young people were in the movement, and their narratives are not always emphasized, but is so powerful. And of course, Claudette Colvin is in the news because she, at the time, was arrested. So she's now demanding that her record be cleared, and she's in her 80s now. And so that's one person who comes to mind. Also, Ella Baker, of course. There are so many, I think, folks who write about Ella Baker. I think immediately about Barbara Ransby, who's written an amazing book on Ella Baker. But still, I think we need to know more about Ella Baker, and I would love it if everyone would, pick up Barbara Ransby's book. Ella Baker was the visionary behind the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, that I mentioned earlier. And in fact, she was a mentor for Hamer, someone that Hamer truly admired and learned from. Those are just two quick examples, but I'm writing a book now on Black women and the struggle for human rights from 1865 to the present. So, wow, so many women that I'm even encountering for the first time in the process of doing the research. There are so many stories that have yet to be told.
And how powerful to tell those stories. We have a lot of questions and just a few minutes left with you, Dr. Blaine, but let's do our best. Here's one. So many young people want to address injustice today, but doing so can feel intimidating or impossible to them. What do you think Fannie Lou Hamer would want to tell them?
I think Fannie Lou Hamer would say that you have to be courageous. And I understand that, of course, it is often easier said than done. I think about my own life and the moments where I've had to be courageous and at times been fearful to speak up in the face of injustice. I think one of the lessons from Hamer's life might be instructive here. And that is, we oftentimes are thinking about how to strategize alone. We're often thinking about how to fix all kinds of problems alone. And the irony is that we don't have to work alone. We actually don't have to strategize alone. Could Hamer have stayed in that meeting in August 1962? Hamer could have listened to what activists had to say. She could have said, aha, okay, I have this information I need. She could have walked out of that meeting and decided to lead her own campaign on her, just on her own. And she could have. Many people have certainly taken those kinds of approaches, but she joined the movement. She joined an organization. She connected herself with like-minded individuals, and they provided support for her, and they provided, I think, the kind of structure that made it possible for her to work effectively. So I emphasize this because I always tell my students, you have to be creative and you have to be thinking about ways that you could come up with strategies, but understand that there are people already working, right? There are groups already established, organizations, organizations like the NAACP have been around for a very, very long time. The Urban League, and these are just two quick examples of places and spaces where you can tap into them, you can connect, and figure out how you could be of service, and how you could, lend your skills and your talents. So I think that's an approach, and there's strength in numbers. So sometimes when you lack courage, you can find the courage often when you're connected with other individuals who may be fearful too, but your presence gives them a sense of empowerment, and their presence will do the same for you. So I hope that's helpful in thinking about how to strategize, as a young person, whether it's on your campus or off the campus.
Courage is so important. Thank you for that. Here's another question. So many of us look up to Fannie Lou Hamer as a leader. Do you know if she had any role models or anyone she admired in her life?
Absolutely. And so I mentioned Ella Baker, and also Bob Moses, who, unfortunately passed away fairly recently. There's a moment where we were talking about the DNC earlier, and Hamer, as much as I explained in the book, she was so defiant. She was clear about not wanting to accept the compromise of the 2 seats. There was a particular moment where she began to doubt, naturally, because she's watching all of these well-known, established, well-respected leaders challenge her over and over again. And there's a moment where she begins to wonder, is she really making the right decision in sticking with her convictions? So she goes to Bob Moses and Ella Baker, And she poses a question to them, do you think I'm making the right decision? And they say to her, you know what's best, not only for you, but you know what's best for the people of Mississippi. We trust you, and we trust you to make the right decision. And she talks about how powerful that was for her to strengthen her in the moment. And she always looked to them just as two examples, as mentors who never tried to tell her what to do. They would encourage her. They would invest their time and resources, but they never pushed her around and said, listen, this is the right way, this is the wrong way. They allowed her to operate, through her gifts and her abilities. And so those are just two quick examples of individuals who Hamer identified as mentors and certainly as friends.
Well, it's pretty amazing. Our time together is almost coming to a close, but I got a question in the chat. I have to ask you really quickly. If you, Dr. Blaine, had the opportunity to ask Fannie Lou Hamer any question, what would you ask her?
Wow, my first inclination is to ask her thoughts on the book. And I'm not sure I want the answer. As I said, Hamer was very blunt. As I wrote the book, more than anything else, I want to make sure that I've done justice, to her story. I certainly agonized over every chapter, every word, because I would hate to have presented something incorrectly, and be curious to know her thoughts. But I think probably the other thing that crosses my mind is I'd want to know from her if she would do anything differently. As I point out in the book, towards the end of her life, she was struggling with, feelings of depression and sadness, not only dealing with the physical ailments, but just emotionally, everything had just taken a toll on her. And I'm just curious to know if she would have done anything differently. Would she still have given that powerful speech at the DNC? Would she still have spoken out against, so many different things that she spoke out against, which caused her problems and in her personal life, certainly in her political life? That's a question that I would ask her. I'd be curious to know what she would say.
We would, in modern parlance, call that trauma. Through her trauma, it's no doubt she's a great patriot of our time. I want to thank you, audience, for your terrific questions. And before we officially wrap, Dr. Keisha Blaine, it's a tradition here to ask all of our speakers the following question. I'd love for you to answer. What is your 60-second idea to change the world? You got 60 seconds.
Wow.
So.
Honestly, I think it goes right back to Fannie Lou Hamer. If we could just all shift our perspective and begin to think more about others than ourselves. Honestly, I think if we took that approach, we could probably fix just about every challenge that we're facing as a nation and as, I think as people collectively across the globe. We could overturn so many systems of oppression if we would just shift the focus from I to we.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that. Thank you, Dr. Keisha N. Blaine, for joining me today on Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. Thank you all for joining us. A reminder that the fabulous, fabulous book, Until I Am Free, can be purchased through your preferred bookseller. And if you'd like to watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club's effort in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Amy Allison. It's been such a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you so much and stay safe.